Thanks to our sponsors for bringing us together. It's really great. And Jean-Louis, a special thanks to you. Also, I want to press a little bit on this word of scale, which he introduced in the introduction. I think that's a very crucial word when we're talking about architecture and war. During the early Nazi successes of the Soviet campaign, the goals for a German East dovetailed all too neatly and brutally with the development of genocidal plans. And each were an important component of the SS interest in the expansion of its sphere of influence in the expansion of Greater Germany. As has been well documented, particularly by Robert Jan van Pelt and Deborah Dvork, the architecture of the concentration camp Auschwitz fit all too well into both goals, as it was a center of SS ideology, but also a resurgent Germanic East, and also the grotesque focus of a vast genocidal system. For them, the camp architect's office, which you see here under Karl Bischoff, formed the fundamental core for both settlement plans and the construction of genocidal facilities, casting light on how cultural and murderous goals were interrelated during World War II. For Dvork and Van Pelt, the ideological and ultimately imperial agenda of the Germans in the East gradually transformed Auschwitz into a center of genocide with the expansion of the war. But while the genocidal function of Auschwitz cannot be denied its historical importance and obviously has taken a center stage in the literature, I would like to argue here that the architecture of the site demands an extended analysis that takes into account the greater variety of camp spaces, both the gruesome sites of oppression of the victims, but also the hundreds of buildings that made up the world of the perpetrators. In these terms, the architecture that enabled the genocide was also responsible for a wide plurality of other functions, each of which supported the imperial goals of the Nazi state during World War II, and you get some sense of the variety of functions on this map here. Analyzing these multiple relationships of architecture and spatial planning to the goals of the military drive foregrounds not only the central role of a racist and ideological social agenda, but also the key ways in which imperialism requires specific kinds of productive spaces. It is how the function of the buildings and the space developed in relation to the productive political economic conditions of empire that is of interest here. That functional question requires a different understanding and analysis of the architecture and built environment than has previously been the case. As Corinne Ott has asserted, much of the literature on Auschwitz and the other camps too often, if naturally, isolates the camps from the broader structural development of the SS system as a whole. Hence, however much a history of Dachau or Buchenwald is integrated into the war or larger state policy, the relationship of the camps to each other in a developing system has been of less concern, and there are a few exceptions in the last decade, particularly around the study of the SS Wirtschafts- und Verwaltungshauptamt. To analyze the developing relationship between concentration camp architecture and the political economic goals of the military drive, though, we need a more comparative view that sees the transformation of the typology of the camps over time and space. In the following, I will focus on that transformation, looking briefly at Dachau and Flossenbürg, and then focusing more particularly on Auschwitz, as examples of different moments in the growth of the state and its productive as well as destructive capacity. In this analysis, I will be following the extraordinary work by Adam Tooze, Wages of Destruction, in which he argues for the importance of reinserting the economic goals of the state into any analysis of the ideological reorganization of the Eastern occupied territories. In asserting that political economy is just as central as an ideological agenda, when looking at the symbolic and productive shifts in the built environment of the camps, we can use architectural developments to open up the important question of how an imperialist agenda is enabled and enacted in the first place. This is naturally a central concern in any analysis that encompasses architecture's relationship to World War II. While central to the historical literature on Nazi Germany, concentration camps have, with few exceptions, been almost entirely absent from the architectural literature on the period. Most likely, this is a result of two factors. On the one hand, art historians have ignored or minimized the analysis of institutional architecture in favor of a focus on higher profile monuments and architects like Albert Speer. And on the other, the relatively banal and vernacular architectural world of the camps has been deemed visually less complex than other state building, even if its historical significance is obviously profound. In terms of the latter, little could be more obvious than the layout of all the labor and death camps, excepting the Operation Reinhardt camps, in a traditional institutional plan of symmetrical pavilions surrounding a central plaza. Whatever the variations, this institutional plan has a long history, as we see here in this plan by Bluet, as a productive type, being associated with military, social, and industrial organizational structures, amongst others. The institutional plan emphasizes its relationship to production through its repetitive and rational organizational clarity. Concentration camps were founded almost as soon as the Nazis came to power in January 1933. The Prussian Ministry of the Interior set up early camps such as Bürgermoor and Esterwagen and utilized makeshift wooden barracks. But the link between military, productive, and punitive functions was made unintentionally clear in the first Bavarian camp at Dachau, set up by Himmler in March of 1933. And you see that first site. Himmler's SS intended Dachau as a model of order and stability, asserting their authority and ability to control the punishment of those deemed enemies of the Nazi state, such as communist, labor leaders, and others. As you see here, such assertions were buttressed with the camp's first layout, which took over the form of a munitions factory, and particularly here is quite crucial, the form of a munitions factory that had previously existed on the site. The plan, with pavilions to the east, laid out symmetrically for the prisoners, indicates the obvious need to regiment, observe, and control the penal population. This tried and true formula would be used by the SS in subsequent camps, and the organization of the environment and administration would be based on what was called the Dachau model. Yet as Hitler increased his authority in Germany, the SS attempted to expand its usefulness to the state, particularly through its control of the concentration camp system, a control it achieved concomitant with the reorganization of the German police under Himmler in 1936. Himmler ordered all pre-1936 camps except Dachau closed and new facilities constructed along the Dachau model. This led to the large camps of Buchenwald and Sachsenhausen, established around major train lines and population centers. While in 1938, Himmler and his administrative chief Oswald Pohl set up also Mauthausen and Flossenbürg in more obscure locations around major stone quarries. The latter signaled the desire of the SS to use its control over people to make itself indispensable to Hitler's main peacetime initiative, his monumental building campaign. The quarries were centered on high-quality granite deposits, particularly suitable for Speer's plans in Nuremberg and Berlin, just as the brickworks first established at Sachsenhausen could also serve that goal. But ironically, as the camp populations grew with more and more categories of arrested peoples falling into SS hands, and as the productive capacity of the camps became more central to their punitive function, the SS facilities around the camps and SS architects themselves created spaces and structures increasingly distant from the focus on mere productive efficiency. The prisoner barracks and some other parts of the camps certainly followed the earlier interest in variations of the ever-efficient institutional plan. But the perpetrator spaces, both in and outside the camp, were increasingly aestheticized and often monumentalized, as you see here at Mauthausen. At the quarry camps, this was particularly evident in the construction of the walls and guard facilities, which took on ever larger scale proportions. Mimicking medieval fortifications with massive and rough-cut stonework, the walls and guard towers asserted the ideology of the SS as the new elite class of knights within the Nazi state. Such bombastic ideological claims were paralleled with more mundane but nevertheless aesthetic treatments of the SS space. At Flossenbürg, which along with Auschwitz has the best remaining Bauverwaltung records of any of the camps, anonymous engineers and administrators from the SS Central Office in Berlin made clear to the camp personnel that the watchtowers, for example, should not be merely functional. Indeed, one report asked that the drawings and plans for the towers be completed not only in stone, but with careful attention to the placement and aesthetic of the stone. Further, the masons should be instructed not to lay them out in repetitious lines, but rather the facade of these buildings should have, quote, a playfully crafted quality, end quote, of semi-random and hence more pleasing placement. That they served the needs of surveillance to keep the prisoners controlled and productive was assumed, while the focus of interest in the SS construction here was shifting towards the aesthetic. The same logic was followed in other spaces in the camp, such as the layout of the SS officers' housing estate. Let's see if I can go, oh, there we go. Oh. It doesn't seem to like that slide. Here you see the prisoner area. Here's the SS housing estate down there. While the prisoner area followed a rigid institutional plan with ordered symmetrical pavilions, the estate took its cues from generic garden city planning, with houses arranged around two curving streets. The houses themselves were set off-axis to the street and were constructed with stone foundations and low wooden eaves that paralleled local construction aesthetics. Their normality belied the labor involved, which was that of the inmate population, with its attendant suffering and political persecution. The forced labor quarry camp construction in the late 1930s and into the early war years appear exceptional in their use of stone and medievalist forms in relation to other camps, and in particular to the death camps that the SS set up to enact the genocide in the eastern occupied territories. And yet the distancing role that specific aesthetic and formal architectural and spatial decisions played in relation to the destructive capacity of the war and genocide increasingly served the larger goals of the Nazi imperialist political economy during World War II. And at Auschwitz and elsewhere, it expanded on earlier functions of camp construction and planning. Here again, the control and development of the spaces of the perpetrators is revealing. In formal terms, the characteristic feature of the SS-built environment were repetition of familiar forms and symbolic referencing of vernacular traditions. Here, for example, the SS sauna, built by forced labor for the troops, this is from a photo from the Zentralbauverwaltung in 1943, draws on obvious Central European carpentry traditions in the wood panels, which are also indicated in the plans, as well as roofing. Such vernaculars can also be seen in the refurbished and redesigned Zollhutte, the recreational facility on the Zolla River, upstream from the camp where SS officers went to relax, as was revealed in the shocking set of Karl Höcke's pictures that has recently come to light. In both cases, the familiarity of the architectural environment and its use create a naturalized connection to the non-camp lives and backgrounds of SS guards and officers, distancing them from the productive use of thousands of prisoners in forced labor at the camp, as well as the implementation of the ideological agenda of genocide in the gas chambers. Such a distancing project only works, however, if the spaces between and around the buildings are equally controlled. This was not only true for the spaces of the predominantly Jewish inmates, who existed in a world of seemingly endless, symmetrically arranged pavilions, if they were allowed to live at all. It was also true for the world of the SS. Innumerable memorandum from the increasingly centralized control of the built environment by Hans Kammler in his Amt See in the SS headquarters in Berlin made clear that, for example, street designs in the surrounding areas of the camp needed to be visually unified and ordered, and plans had to be sent to Berlin for approval so standardized presentation could be maintained. In addition, SS members themselves were carefully regulated in the vast terrain of the camp spaces. Commandant Höss gave out numerous orders about where an SS member could and could not go, including, for example, strict laws about staying out of the casino in the city of Auschwitz, keeping their family members in only certain areas of the entire Interessegebiet, and areas of the camp that may or may not be visited by or without permission. My point here would be that the architectural and urban environment and the vast scale of this site used by the SS outside of the spaces of their abuse of the prisoners was highly regulated, visually controlled, and tending towards buildings that emphasized familiarity and repetition of form, much more so than pre-war camp spaces. These characteristics were made explicit in the orders of the Zentralbauverwaltung that governed the development of the space by Bischoff and his architects. And yet, in relation to the brutal extent of the genocide itself, is this brief overview of spatial typologies in the camp that much more than a side issue, rightfully relegated to the corners of our history of the Nazi state or the war? The information we gain from understanding architecture and what I've characterized as the perpetrators' increasing distance from production help us to clarify the essential imperialist ambitions of the Nazi war drive. These ambitions differed from the early goals of the Nazi state in consolidating its controls over peoples and institutions and developing its own institutional identity, each of which explains the formal decisions, for example, at Dachau and Flossenbürg. but of course the essential spatial characteristic of Auschwitz in terms of the massive scale, but also in the regulation of spaces for victim and perpetrators alike, as well as the kinds of spaces specifically for the perpetrators, indicate a different kind of function for the camp in relationship to the Nazi goals. A key function was obviously ridding the empire of racial and political undesirables through genocide and murder, both in the camps and at the fronts. But, returning to Adam Tooze's thesis, this was not merely an ideological drive for racial purity and a fantasy return to a medieval agricultural community, as Dvorkin and Van Pelt would have it. Rather, Tooze makes clear that the military goals for control over the Eastern Territory included the economic necessity identified early on by Hitler, not only for agricultural estates, but also to establish stable and internally controlled markets for good and agriculture that could survive separate from the hostile world around Germany, and autarky once again comes forward. In this sense, the model was less medieval Central Europe and much more, as Tooze established, that of the United States, circa 1900, when the US government supported movement west to build the productive agricultural capacity of the population, but also expand the consumer basis for goods, all at the expense of an indigenous population marked as racially inferior. As formulated in the Generalplan Ost, the military drive encompassed a timetable for clearing an estimated 45 million people out of Eastern Europe to establish just such a new German political economy. The key point here is the inseparable connection between ideologically driven genocide and the war in terms of the necessity for both to produce effectively the new political economy of Germany. For our purposes, the question is, what does such an imperial ambition require spatially and architecturally? For Auschwitz, such a view redirects our attention to the fact that genocide and forced labor were not parallel tracks, one ideological and the other productive, but that each was a necessary component of the ultimate political economic goal. The massive scale of the space, with its variety of separations and multiple buildings, is the required scale of imperialism itself. And yet it also addressed the inherently inhumane nature of that imperialism. For to establish an imperial state, it requires the central nation to assert its claim of superiority in physical and military terms over the peoples of other states. As Hannah Arendt famously pointed out in her text on Eichmann in Jerusalem, it was precisely this tendency of the Nazi elite to see the need to assert their dominance over others and rid the human species of the Jews that pointed to its dystopic and self-destructive character. The essence of the human is diversity, and by extension, societies made up of interacting players of equal humanity. If the genocide against the Jews and others revealed the perpetrator's anti-human evil in relation to the former point by challenging the essential nature of diversity itself, the imperialist control and manipulation of massive populations through occupied Europe point to the latter. These anti-human tensions produced unresolvable and difficult to maintain contradictions that had to be alleviated to guarantee a productive imperialism, a tactic that could be achieved with help from architecture and the cultural realm. Here, I think one additional concept needs to be added to our mix, the concept of the Phantasmagoria. The Phantasmagoria is the image that allows the consumer to distance her or himself from production, asserting an eternal and timeless essence instead of a time-bound sense of an object of labor. The illusionistic aspects of the Phantasmagoria rely heavily on the repetition of the known in the guise of the new, and I think this photo functions in these terms. As Adorno put it, Phantasmagoria comes into being when, under the constraints of its own limitations, modernity's latest products come close to the archaic. Every step forward is at the same time a step into the remote past. As bourgeois society advances, it finds that it needs its own camouflage of illusion, simply in order to subsist. For only when so disguised does it venture to look the new in the face, end quote. Such a description characterizes the normalization of the environment through vernacular and familiar institutional, spatial, and architectural choices, as well as the rigid control of interaction between the perpetrator space and those assigned to the victim in the camp. It is also revealed in how the SS depicted the spaces of oppression in its own internal representations with their highly aestheticized stylistic choices. So, for example, the famed photos in the Stroop Report, which you see here, produced after the suppression of the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, have clear 19th century German romantic overtones in their compositions and effects, and I'm thinking particularly of this kind of repoussoir effect of this soldier here. In contrast, the SS photos in the so-called Auschwitz album of the 1944 transport of Hungarian Jews are the familiar work of the forensic racial scientist that nevertheless positions many of the victims in a distorted, even abstracted space, unrelated to the familiar world of the German bourgeois. In each, either normalizing or distancing the perpetrator's viewer becomes an important part of the representation of space. And in each case, the process of normalizing or the abstraction of the space both mystify the relationship of the photographic object from the production of empire, which here is embodied in the project of genocide. Given my time limitations, this is necessary a very loose laying out of evidence and a preliminary argument. But what I've attempted to show is that the built environment of the concentration camps exists in complex relation to the developing productive goals of the Nazi state. These productive goals end not only in the imperial wartime ambition of a racially pure Europe, but the concomitant political economic necessity of ridding Eastern European of its Jews and the millions of other unwanted populations to create a Germanic productive space. Analyzing the architectural choices of the camp gives us some insight into how that project developed, but also how architecture could help to achieve imperialism by distracting and distancing the perpetrator from the brutality of the productive forces necessary to bring about the dystopia. In the modern world, the establishment of empire, a project of unimaginable brutality, can only be possible when one looks away from the violence of the state necessary to its production. The regulation of space, as well as the careful construction of the perpetrator's environment, helped to achieve that condition that allowed the Nazi inhumanity to advance apace. Thank you.